Hello, I am very happy to welcome you to our Young Adult Writers Series and being held tonight at the Missoula Public Library. And I'm very happy that you're here and especially pleased to have our honored guest, Deirdre McNamer, here who will speak to us about her books. And I'd also like to thank Barb Thoreau of Fact and Fiction for being with us tonight, who will introduce our guest. Barb is a wonderful resource in the community for good books and good book groups. So if you want to find a good read or know about a group reading particular material, you may stop in at Fact and Fiction Bookstore and visit with Barb about that. I'd also like to thank Freddy's for, again, providing treats for tonight. This is really, to me, a wonderful collaborative effort of community, school, and the library, where we come together to provide refreshments and information for our young adults in our community, and also to give them a forum for speaking their views and communicating through writing and reading their thoughts and feelings, which are very, very important. So I would like to thank Barb and have her come up and introduce Dee.
Thank you for this kind words. It is nice to be in a community where libraries and bookstores do work together and cooperate and sponsor many different types of events. I'm also active with the Friends of the Library and the public library here, and the Friends have also donated some money to help out with some of the expenses with the program, and I think it's an exciting thing to do. Tonight I'm pleased to be able to introduce Dee McNamer, who is a native Montanan. I think she was one of the first native Montanans I met when I came to Montana several years ago. She grew up in Conrad and Cut Bank on the High Line, as it's called, along the Milwaukee Road, the railroad. She's one of three sisters. All three of the sisters do happen to live here in Missoula. And I did ask one sister yesterday, I said, you know, I've never even asked or heard, do you have any other sibling? And she said, yes, we have one brother who's very quiet and lives in Texas. Now, I don't know if that's because the three sisters drove him out or not, but anyway, it was nice to know that, yes, there was another McNamer. She's published 2 novels with Harper. At the time, I guess it was Harper Row when they were first published, but it's now HarperCollins. Rima in the Weeds and One Sweet Quarrel. Both of the books do draw upon her experiences, I'm sure, with being in Montana and combating why you want to be here and why you want to leave and how you end up surviving by being within a state with the expanse and the land and the peoples that you have. She lives in Missoula now, teaches at the university, and also is visiting professor a lot at various writing programs across the country. She's married to Brian DeSalvador, who I'm sure several of you also know and recognize the name. So, without further ado, welcome Dee McNamer.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to the people at the library, the Barbaras, the Suzettes, all of you who really make Missoula such a good book town. And I hope, and I trust that it goes, I know it does actually, in the schools, clear from the college level down to little kids. There are adults in this community who are concerned that children and students of all ages get to know the pleasures of reading, I think is what it comes down to. And they have a lot of other things competing for their time now in terms of how they learn about the world. And books are starting to seem sometimes a little strange, probably. But I have faith, and I really think that with this new generation of kids coming up, there are people who are concerned that they know what books can offer that no other medium can. And So I applaud those of you out there in the schools who are trying to write, because it's not easy to do. And I trust that you are writing probably because you're reading and have learned really what joy and transport there is in the written word. I'm going to read two rather short sections from my first novel, Rima in the Weeds. And that's an odd title, I know. I had to fight to keep it. It's not an easily sellable title, but one of the sections I hope will show you where it came from. A lot of this book really was generated by my own growing up time in the 50s in north central Montana, and I began it when I was in graduate school here by just writing little vignettes of episodes that I remembered from my own childhood. And then I just tried to make them fuller and more interesting, and I eventually ended up with a lot of material revolving around this character, Margaret, who is an 11-year-old girl, and she's the main character in the book. I like to think of her as a braver, more interesting version of myself. She went through a lot of things she goes through a lot of things that I did, but I think she deals with them in a somewhat more interesting manner, I hope. Okay, this is chapter 1. March that year was full of wind that rolled across the world with a sound as clean and lonely as rushing water. It rocked the stripped cottonwoods, hurried clouds across the sky, sprayed gravel against bare legs. You walked into it with a forward tilt. Margaret Greenfield lay in bed listening. At night, the wind was an ocean that whooshed forward, ebbed for the span of a train whistle or a dog's bark, whooshed again. She let it wash over her, safe on shore in a way that did not then feel temporary. She lay beneath her warm blankets and the wind died a little, and then it sounded as if it were ruffling a huge sheet. This made her think of her mother's wedding veil. Margaret's parents, Roy and Mary Ellen, had gotten married 11 years earlier in the windy spring of 1951, a year to the day before Margaret was born. As soon as Mary Ellen stepped out of the church, a gust blew the veil straight off her head. One black and white snapshot in the album shows her standing on the church steps, laughing, her shiny dress blown tightly around her hips, her pretty hand grabbing for the veil. Another shows the veil alone against the branch-crossed sky, a square of gauzy white, solitary and willful. And then more pictures, the veil wrapped around a bare branch, 2 men in suits climbing a single ladder, cigarettes clenched in their teeth. And another, the last of the 2 men again. One is hatless and grinning, the other has a shadow over his face. They are on the ground, the veil stretched triumphantly between them. By then, Mary Ellen has disappeared from the pictures. She has gone off to be a wife. Margaret didn't know why a certain kind of wind at night made her think of the veil in the air. It was just one of those cases where 2 things stuck together. Whenever she smelled a big hunk candy bar, for instance, she thought of the movie Cat People. She must have eaten a big hunk when she saw it at the Rialto, but she had eaten them at other movies too. Who knows why they were linked to a specific one? A single nougaty whiff and she could see every scene. She could see Irena, the beautiful, shy woman with a panther inside her that took over when she was made jealous or passionate. It was an old, simmering curse. When the panther sprang to life, Irena couldn't help what she did. She couldn't remain human if she tried. To raise money that spring, Margaret's catechism class sold plastic cylinders with a figure of the Virgin Mary inside. They were beige and looked on the outside like foot-long rockets. A seam ran from base to tip, and it parted like cathedral doors to reveal the praying woman inside. They cost $2 apiece. Anyone who sold 3 of them got to name an African pagan baby who would be baptized by missionaries when the money was sent in. Margaret sold 6 and named her babies Audrey and Gidget. Trudging on Saturday mornings from door to door, selling the Virgin rockets, Margaret gathered evidence of something she already felt in her bones, that Madrid, where she lived, was not just a gappy little town on the northern Montana plains. Far from it. It was a place of layers and mysteries, of hidden rooms and muffled dramas. Selling the rockets, she saw, through a slat in a Venetian blind, an old man in red boxer shorts vacuuming a carpet. She heard Mr. Badenoch, the meek grade school principal, singing in a heartbreaking voice from beneath a car in his garage. And she watched a three-legged dog with a bow on its collar hop through a tunnel in some bushes. She was invited into a living room where everything was covered in plastic, the lamps, the couch, even an arrangement of plastic flowers. A woman in a pink apron sat her on the crackling couch. The wind moaned beneath the eaves as the woman poked through a change purse for money. A young man in an old man's bathrobe and slippers padded through an adjoining room carrying binoculars. She saw an immense salmon-colored Cadillac waiting for her to cross an intersection and remembered suddenly that she had seen it in a dream with palm trees and warm sand that trickled through her fingers, a dream so happy she woke laughing. But this was the most mysterious of all. One morning she knocked lightly on the door of a yellow ranch-style house on Skyline Boulevard, her rockets in a shoebox under her arm, and heard a woman's distant cry. "So who are you anyway?" she heard. "Who are you?" It seemed to come from behind several doors, from behind thick castle walls. It seemed to be shouting at a deaf person, a crowd, the entire town. "I have no idea," it wailed, "who you could possibly be." On the day of the airplane ride, the second Saturday in April, Margaret woke to silence. No wind, none at all. Not even the usual breeze. This put a flutter of apprehension beneath her rib cage. If there was no wind, not even a breath of it, what would lift the small plane off the ground? What would boost it into the sky? She climbed out of bed carefully and tried to feel nonchalant. She phoned her best friend, Rita Kay, who had arranged the plane ride, the first for both of them, and asked whether she had any worries about the strangely silent skies. Rita Kay hooted at her. "It doesn't take wind," she said. "It takes air, and there's always air. At least there was the last time I checked." This was a new expression of Rita Kay's, "the last time I checked." She had borrowed it from her older brother, Eugene, a small teenager who had already wrecked 2 cars, and she said it in a blithe, proprietary way that wounded Margaret a little. It was a glittering, suspended morning. Sun shot off the small patches of ice left from the last cold snap of the season. The silent air made the sparrows too loud. Rita Kay's father fiddled with the radio dial as he drove them to the airport, skimming the tops of voices and music the way the plane would soon skim above the solid, comforting earth. The rides were part of a fundraising effort to repave the airport runway. Rita Kay had seen the ad in the paper and pestered her parents and Margaret's until they said yes. Now she bounced triumphantly on the seat, picking slivers of pink polish off her tiny fingernails. Margaret pressed her nose against the cold window and devoured scraped-looking stubble fields with her eyes, noticing for the first time how anchored and substantial they looked. The airplane was intensely red and white and black, and it was parked just outside the doors of the metal hangar at the Darrell Johnson Memorial Airport. Bob Ronachek, the pilot, squatted beside it in a large plaid overcoat, examining one of the wheels. A large sign on the hangar wall said, "Weekend rides, $10 for 20 minutes you'll never forget." The minute he slammed the doors shut, Margaret knew she was trapped in a horrible mistake. It was the sound of the doors, light and plastic, incredibly light. She was sealed inside a toy, and a man she didn't even know was going to aim it straight into the sky. "I should jump out now," she thought. "It will be embarrassing, but I'll be alive." The only doors, though, were in the front, and Margaret had been placed in the back. Rita Kay sat in the co-pilot seat next to Bob and craned her neck out the window. She turned and grinned at Margaret. Bob pushed a button that made the plane roar and shake. He placed headphones over his ears and muttered into a microphone. He checked the seat belts. Too late. Margaret shut her eyes and consulted her vision of heaven. For as long as she could remember, everyone up there had been peering over a bank of snowy clouds, monitoring the world with gentle smiles. The old god was flanked by his immediate family and friends who watched with him. Mary, a pretty blue oval, Jesus, thin and pale-eyed, resting his young man's beard on the old man's shoulder. The Holy Ghost, wings stretched like a quivering silver canopy over their heads. And then all the rest, fanning out to the edges of the sky, tall to short, babies on the end, saints and martyrs and grandparents and orphans, robed and peaceful, looking down with encouraging eyes at her, Margaret, and the rest of the heavily turning blue world. She knew the vision was too pretty and simple, like a Christmas card, that the details were probably more obscure and elaborate, but the feel of it remained. They were a big surprise party that would welcome her with quiet cheers when she died, providing she had not somehow pitched herself into a canyon of soul-killing sin. That's why it wasn't so bad to die young. You had less time to mess things up. When they wanted you, you should be happy to go. Not yet, she hissed at them angrily, surprising herself. Bob put a second pair of earphones on Rita Kay, who squealed with pleasure. The little plane began to move slowly toward the runway, rocking a little from side to side. Margaret stared at the floor. She imagined rows of powerful, hurt eyes. Then she gathered herself and spoke again. I do not want to be with you. Stop looking at me. Bob glanced over his shoulder and lifted one earphone away from his head. You want something? He shouted. She shook her head. No, she mouthed, nothing. Bob slowed the plane, turned it a quarter turn, stopped it. He turned a handle on the ceiling, then pushed a lever, and the motor roared alive. The sound grew, a terrible winding up until it screamed like a monster mosquito. The little capsule felt as if it would explode. One more notch and the seams would burst, spitting them all onto the concrete. At the last moment, he pulled the lever in again, and the sound trailed away. They crawled to the runway. He checked their seat belts again and did a jaunty thumbs up. He pushed the lever, and the engine started to climb, but this time they were moving with it. Faster, faster. The ground blurred, everything blurred, and then, just as it seemed they would never make it, that they would go roaring into a fence or a field and explode in flames, the earth dropped away from them like a stone, releasing them to the liquid sky. Small tears seeped from the corners of Margaret's clenched eyes. The little plane circled and climbed. Then Bob lowered the nose so that it felt horizontal and announced above the roar that they were circling back over Madrid. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down, expecting an intricate little city, somehow made roofless by the plane's spying height. Finally, she could peek down pathways, into shaded corners, over hedges, through doorways. It would take hours to see everything down there on Earth, her home. But Madrid lay on the immense animal back of the earth, like the pieces of a miniature board game or a smashed raft. It was thin and gappy and had a dull cardboard look to it. Nothing stood out except the oil tanks and the Lutheran church steeple and the Saddle Club arena. The rest was just shadowless little boxes and the gray lines of streets. If a town could be bald, Madrid was that, bald and terrifyingly small. How about that, girls? Bob yelled above the roar of the engine. Rita Kay had her nose and hands pressed to the window. Her yellow fluff of hair looked electric. I see my house, she screamed. I see Debbie. Debbie was her elderly Persian cat. You can't see Debbie, Margaret said in a low voice. You can't see anything. She felt sheer, bone-hollow disappointment. There was nothing wonderful about Madrid. The whole place looked flimsy and temporary. She tried to feign eagerness by looking out her own window. Beyond the town were great stretches of buff-colored grass and striped wheat fields, dark fallow soil alternating with pale stubble, reaching in shallow waves to the skyline. A couple of cars inched like bugs along Highway 2, and some freight cars sat by a gleaming clump of miniature grain silos. Her vision reached so far that the horizons curved downward, and there was nothing sheltering on that earth except the row of mountains on the far western edge of everything. Madrid was lost at sea, Margaret thought, and didn't even know it. So that's her getting a look at her town from another perspective. This is some months later. And this has to do with those crushes that you get when you're little. I mean, pretty little. And they can be so fierce, the young first crushes. So this is about her crush on somebody called Woody Blankenship. She'd had the dream 2 months earlier on November 24th. The day before it happened, she put on a sweater and her big headscarf with the horse picture on it and started down the frozen alleyways toward Rita Kay's house, 4 blocks from her own. It was Thanksgiving vacation, and she had the feeling her friend might be organizing something. Kick the can, run sheep run. At the far end of the first alley, she saw a boy and girl, high school age, leaning together against a sagging wooden garage. The girl had her back to the garage, and the boy faced her. He was taller than she was and wore no coat, just a T-shirt and jeans. His arms were muscled like a grown man's, and they were propped against the garage wall, the girl between them. They smiled at each other in a glittering, challenging sort of way. Margaret thought this looked interesting. She walked a little farther, then stopped. They didn't notice her, so she slipped behind 2 tall garbage cans, crouched, and watched. She thought the girl looked almost exactly like Audrey Hepburn in Green Mansions. She had the same delicate, big-eyed face, but a thinner, tougher mouth. She wore ordinary teenager clothes, jeans and loafers, but she had on top of them the most beautiful fringed leather jacket Margaret had ever seen. It was the color of butter and had very long, very thin fringes, rows of them across the front, across the bottom, and flowing beneath the sleeves like a shawl. Margaret crouched lower. She could almost make out what they were saying, but not quite. The girl tilted her head back and shook her bangs out of her eyes. She laughed. The boy leaned in closer. Then they both stopped laughing. The girl raised her hands and put them on the boy's bare arms. The wind skittered down the alley and blew the leather fringes of her coat straight up, suspending them for a second or two. Then the fringes dropped, and the boy put his hands behind her neck and kissed her for a long time, leaning into her. Margaret watched them. First, she felt as though she had stumbled upon a piece of entertainment, an odd skit, and regretted that Rita Kay was not there to see it too. But then another feeling took over. Her eyelids drooped, and she felt a delicious languor as she focused on the softly swaying fringes. It was the same hypnotic feeling she sometimes got when she watched someone do something complicated with great care. Like the time Mrs. Flickinger in the first grade had shown her how to fold paper and cut it to make a snowflake. Mrs. Flickinger had long fingers and was very quiet and graceful. Margaret remembered watching her hands as she folded a sheet of white paper this way, then that, and how she had cut very slowly into the paper, making small diamonds, half-moons, commas. She had felt an intense dreaminess come over her as she watched, something that was not a tired feeling at all, but made her want to watch what she was watching forever. When the teenagers left, she stayed behind the garbage cans for a while and thought about fringe jackets. It seemed to her that she had never noticed fringe jackets before, and now they seemed like the best kind of coat a person could have. She wanted one badly. Rita Kay had a red plastic coat with plastic fringes on it, but that was nothing close. Margaret wanted a soft leather one like the girls in the alley. The fringes would have to be very long like hers, the longest fringes you could get. That way they would be slightly startling. They would wave under your sleeves like water. They would float on the wind. That night, she dreamed that she and a crowd of neighborhood kids were playing hearts and go to the dump in a large pink living room. Then everyone except Margaret and Woody Blankenship put their cards down and left the room. Woody, in real life, was 2 years older than Margaret and lived on a corner across from the high school. He was lanky and freckled and had a silver front tooth. In real life, Margaret had never thought much about him. He was just one of the loud, vaguely irritating older boys who screeched around on their bicycles. Some of them had started to carry black combs in their shirt pockets and ask girls out on dates. In the dream, after everyone else left, Margaret and Woody Blankenship turned into dancing partners, but it wasn't normal dancing. Margaret stood still, facing Woody, then she sprang into the air, right to the ceiling, in a businesslike manner. She jumped high, and then he did too, arms folded away from his body like the Cossack in the school's film strip about the Russians before they were Reds. They bounded upward together, faces close, and landed lightly on their toes. Then they were at the top of a hill, a long and grassy one, wrestling in a comradely way like boys. They threw each other efficiently to the ground and rolled slowly down the long hill, arms around each other. And at the bottom they stopped. Woody was quietly stretched along her body, breathing lightly in her ear. His freckled fingers circled her wrist. They looked at each other, that was all. Woody's mouth was open slightly, and a light winked off the tip of his silver tooth. When Margaret woke, she felt as though something very fragile had been tucked inside her rib cage so that she had to breathe carefully. Something like the hollow, painted egg a neighbor's mother from Czechoslovakia had given them last Easter. Before Rita Kay accidentally crunched it, the egg swirled with glossy stained glass colors, and it was so light when you held it that it felt as if it wasn't there. She lay in bed and stared at the floating bars of sunlight on the ceiling. She reviewed the dream over and over, taking it in little sips to make it last. Her vision about the night things that went on between men and women was fuzzy and involved some kind of friendly but dignified agricultural procedure in which seeds got planted for babies. This was something else altogether. How could she have regarded Woody Blankenship so casually, so blindly all this time? These years, how had she lived just a few blocks from him and failed to realize what a wonderful coincidence that was? She was almost afraid to move, afraid that the dream disturbed might fly away and leave her with ashes on her tongue. But it didn't. She began that day to imagine herself through Woody Blankenship's eyes. She peered into the mirror at her solemn face, her dark eyes, the khaki-colored braids hanging over her shoulders. She smiled at the image, and the smile was for him. She took stairs 2 at a time and ran down them the same way and imagined Woody's frank approval of her strong legs, of her enthusiasm and skill. She didn't feel as if she were being conceited. She felt as if she had been led into a brighter light so that she and the Woody in her dream could see each other clearly for the first time. She began to walk past Woody's house several times a day, not too fast, not too slow. It, too, had changed forever. Before the dream, it had been a small gray house with a couple of scrawny bushes in the front yard. Now it was the place that held Woody. Once, walking past his house in a light snowfall, she saw some T-shirts hanging frozen on the line in the backyard. Woody's T-shirts. The rigid, Woody-sized shapes put a lump in her throat, and she walked faster. Just then, the aluminum door flew open, and Woody and 2 friends came sprinting out, puffing warm clouds of air. Margaret's face froze, and she fixed it straight ahead, willing her pulpy legs to move faster, pretending she was walking too fast to notice him or stop, because if she did, if she looked at him and talked to him, her secret love might spill right out of her eyes and he would see it and be taken aback. Margaret hoarded her thoughts about Woody. She measured each day by the evidence it produced of him, a glimpse of Woody in person or of one of his friends, or even of his dog, an arthritic Labrador named Penny. Sometimes she lay awake at night murmuring prayers. Sacred Heart of Jesus, have mercy on us. Mary, Queen of Heaven, pray for us. She shot the words heavenward against the possibility of loss. So that's Margaret. So if anyone has any questions or comments about writing or books or anything, I'd be happy to discuss them. Thank you. My dad had a little airplane when we were little, and he used to take us, we used to ride around in it quite a lot. I look back now, one was a little 2-seater, and then he had a 4-seater, and now I'm terrified to ride in those things. But I did it all the time then. It was one of those airports without any lights, and he would come in at night sometimes when it was dark and buzz the house, and my mom would have to go drive out to the airport and park at the end of the runway with the lights on. That was Conrad in 1957 or 8. This is sort of a collage town. I mean, it's it's a construct. I made it up, but I imagine it as a combination of Cutbank and Conrad, which are the 2 little towns I lived in, and I located it about where Galata is, if anybody knows that. It's just straight east of Shelby, right on the highway and railroad line there. It's really windy. I forgot to mention that before I read the first part. It just blows like a son of a gun all the time. Anything else? I thought that for kids who are wanting to write, students in the schools, that I don't really have many words of wisdom at all to pass on, but I do think that two things are important. One is that you read a lot. And I even see kids in college now who want to be writers and might even be good at it and are interested in it, but they've sort of gotten out of the habit of reading. And it shows in their work. It's like they sort of heard about speaking French, but they've never actually been in the middle of a language where French is spoken. There's something about reading a lot where you just get a feel for how a sentence sounds good, or how you create a character or a real sharp image. And I don't think there's any substitute for just reading if you have any interest in writing at all. And the other thing I would say is to keep a writer's journal, not just every day, but just carry a little notebook in your pocket and use it to write down things that you notice. My journals were always filled with, the same old anguish for years and years on end. I don't mean that kind of journal where I'm mad and I'm writing in my journal. I wish I'd noticed more things. I go back to these journals and I go, well, where was this? And what year was this? And where was I? All I get is my, emoting onto the page. And that's fine. But there's another kind of journal, I think, that's helpful for a writer. And that is if you just have dead time, you're on the bus or you're waiting for something or you're in line, sometimes you'll just notice odd exchanges that happen between people, or somebody will just catch your eye. And it's really good practice to just write that down in a journal and in your little notebook and try and make it as precise as you possibly can. And you'll find sometimes that a character or a little scene that you've witnessed will become something that shows up in a story later on. And you will forget it if you don't write it down. You think you won't, but you will. I was on a bus in Columbus, Ohio. This was one of my teaching stints in the last couple of years, and I just hated the city, and I hated my job, and I hated everything, and I was wanting to come home, and I rode the bus a lot because it was the most efficient way to get to school. And I remember one soggy November day like this, watching somebody get on the bus. And it was this guy whose face just looked haggard, and he carried this big box, and I realized I was making up this whole story about him. What had happened at work that day, what a jerk his boss was, and what, kind of crummy, poor home he was going home to, and he'd just been battling, every kind of battle all day long, and now he was hauling himself onto this bus. And so I was making up this whole thing, and somebody across the aisle from him started talking about goldfish. And this guy, who I thought was just the saddest person on the face of the earth, he kind of looks up and they start talking about goldfish, and in this really engaged, intense way. And so I had to revise my whole idea about him. And then I really had to revise it when he took the lid off this big, heavy box he'd been carrying, which I thought was full of, papers or bottles or something, and he lifts out this plastic sack with these incredible exotic goldfish in it and holds it up, and they're swimming around in there. And all of a sudden, this bleak bus ride in this bleak town and this bleak day, and my whole story about this bleak guy underwent this sort of wonderful revision. And I thought, well, something about it just made me feel really good. I thought, anybody who's obsessed about goldfish, that's great in my book, and then you can talk about goldfish on the bus with somebody. And so I thought, well, remember that, because there may come a time in a story where you want to show, just that little flash of hope or humor or something that can come through a gray day, and I won't want to have forgotten that. And so I'll use it sometime, probably. You just pilfer all your experience. Yeah, I like it. Go fish for a gray day. Anybody else? Yeah. How did I get going writing? Well, let's see. I grew up reading a lot, and I thought it was because of horrible cruelty on the part of my parents because they would not buy us a television. So we didn't get a television. We were like the last people in town to get a television, and you could always tell who had televisions because there were all the antennas on the roof, and it was so humiliating. So I felt like I was this horrible deprived child, but I ended up actually reading a lot, everything, Nancy Drews, and I just read everything, and because it was entertainment, So, and then I just kind of had an aptitude for English classes, basically, and that's all I knew when I got to college. And I went to college at a rather tumultuous time. It was like 1968 to 73, and campuses were in uprisings, and, it was really, everything was undergoing lots of big changes. And at some point in that time, I thought, well, I've got 4 brothers and sisters following me through school. I better get out of here with something that I can get a job at. And so, to my mind, it was either English teacher or newspaper reporter, because that's what I did the most well, was words and writing. And it just seemed exciting then to be a newspaper reporter. And so I went to journalism school, and I was a journalist, a reporter for, on the Missoulian a long time ago, and Associated Press, and various daily newspapers. And I did that for about 11 years. And that was really good practice. I don't regret a minute of it, because you have to learn how to say really fast exactly what you want to say. And it makes you kind of you kind of got to cut to the chase fast, and get precise. The best journalists are, I think. And so then I got tired of that, and I got a year off. I got a fellowship to go to the University of Michigan, and I got to kind of slow down and just take classes that I wanted and so on. And I read a lot of fiction that year, and I started taking some fiction writing classes, and I went, this is it. This is what I want to do now. I mean, because I'd always been kind of chafing against having to be so factual for newspapers, and that I would find myself interested in characters I interviewed, but I wanted to make up stories about them, and I just wanted to sort of take it off the page and, put it in a different form. And so I ended up getting a MFA in fiction here, but that was basically just to kind of buy me some writing time. And then ever since then, I've just been piecing things together to try and write fiction mostly, and I write a little bit for magazines, and I teach part-time. But that was the trajectory. It was just sort of good in English to journalism school to wanting to do this other thing. Yeah, yeah, a fair number of writers, fiction, people who have made their career fiction, started out in newspapers. It's a good thing to do, I think. Are you interested in journalism or writing? Yeah. It's, some people will say, well, you're either a journalist or a fiction writer, and I just don't believe that at all. It's also very nice if you want to write fiction seriously to have some other thing that you actually can do. I mean, you aren't going to make money at it. It's going to be very unlikely that you will. So I've always wished I had some kind of real, I could be a journalist again, and that's given me confidence to proceed. I can always get a job. I sort of wish I'd learned something that didn't have anything to do with writing or words. I don't know what it would have been for a woman, but like then when I was in college, I just, I wish I would have, if I were a man, I might have learned plumbing or something, just something that paid quite a lot, per hour and didn't have anything to do with the books or reading, but just a skill so that you can keep a roof over your head and sort of pursue this other thing.
Do you find it natural to sit down and write, or is it something you have to structure your time?
Oh, it's hard. It's like, for me, I guess it would be most analogous to just like exercise in some ways. You don't do it for a long time, and then you feel like you can't do it, and you don't get feeling good at it until you keep doing it. So there is this whole element of trying to get a habit going that I've tried to do anyway. And again, journalism was really good for me because I had to meet deadlines. And I'm one of those kinds of people that would never meet a deadline if somebody just didn't, come and grab it away from me, which they do on newspapers. And so you learn you can finish something, and it's probably not as bad as you think it is. And so I have to do real systems of, saying, well, I have to write a page and a half a day, or I have to write 2 pages a day of something. Anything. I'm working on a novel right now, and it's not going easily for me at all. And what I'm trying to do now is just think of my plot, which I have, and my characters, and just write 2 pages a day. Because if I do that, that's, more than 600 pages in a year. So then you go, well, okay, maybe only a fourth of that will survive even. You might just be kind of all over the place. But you'll have that. Anyway, which you wouldn't have if you sat there and waited for the muse to descend, which I don't wait for. It's just work. My second book, One Sweet Quarrel, I think is a better book than my first book. I just think I was writing better, but it felt like work all the way through. This was kind of fun. This, because I was doing it for the first time, and I was kind of zipped up and this great thing to do. And the second book, I just felt like I was in a long distance, toward the end especially, just a marathon. And I would just hope that I would keep getting my second wind, which makes it all sound very grim. And it's not that grim, but it's also not one of those kinds of processes. I know very, very few people who say, well, I just sit down and kind of, sort of lend myself to thinking about my characters, and then they just start doing things, and I just write them down. I wish. That would be great. It feels like work. It just has to, but it also feels like work that's worth it. So, I sort of think of it sometimes as carpentry too, that if you don't get the corner right, you got to just do it over again and be willing to have that kind of patience with getting parts of it right. And I don't have patience for that kind of patience for anything else in the world, really. I don't like card games or crafts or anything that kind of requires just that sort of patience. And writing is the only thing that I've found that I am willing to go back until it's right, as right as I can make it. So it's weird. It's just kind of a strange process. Every writer I know who does very much work over a lifetime or stays alive as a writer seems to develop some work system that's pretty regular. And then they kind of make things work around that. I just heard that Bill Kittredge gets up every day at 5 o'clock and writes. I'm disgusted. Anybody else? Yeah.
Completion of your novel to selling it to a publisher. When did that happen?
I finished this book in 1989, and that was sort of the last of a very flush period in publishing for first novelists. A lot of first novels were getting bought then. And there seemed to be this, there were a lot of big advances. That's the money that they pay you for your book, and then they hope that they can sell enough that it, covers what they paid, and it never does. But big advances were being paid and people were sort of stars overnight. It was just the 80s, there was a lot of versions of that. And so I finished this and I thought, well, I have to, my husband said I couldn't go to Mexico with him unless I got it out of the house. He was doing a freelance assignment for a magazine and he wouldn't take me until I finished this thing. So I had this little deadline and it needed to be done anyway. And I contacted 4 agents I knew of. 2 of them were sort of big-time agents. And I got home from Mexico. I just had a terrible time in Mexico because I was worried about this the whole time. And got back, and 2 of them, I had 2 letters, and 2 of them had said no. And then I had 2 phone calls, and those 2 had said yes, that they wanted to take me on. Which is sort of a lesson, because if I had only sent it to 1 and gotten the letter, or 2 and gotten the 2 letters, I would have really been feeling really set back. But I got this great windfall, which was basically that I had 2 good agents and I got to pick. And that's just luck, and it doesn't happen very often. And the agent that I chose sold it quite rapidly, probably in 2 weeks or something like that. And then for the second book, on the basis of this, and it had sold well enough, I guess, for a first book, that I got an advance to finish my second book. But the 90s had sort of hit, and things are shrinking down, and there are very strange stories out there now about trying to get, established people who have had 6 and 7 novels and won awards and everything, not getting any advance or not selling their latest book. So there's been this sort of corporatization of publishing has happened, and a lot of marketing people making more editorial decisions, and so it's unpredictable. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised with this third book if anything happened. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have an editor who was the same one with these first 2 books and believes in my work, I'm quite sure. I mean, she does. But I don't know what her pressures are, and I don't know. They might look at the sales on the first 2 and go, sorry, I don't know. So that's sort of what you're dealing with now. You really have to do it because you want to do it. And, I haven't gotten any movie sales. That's what I thought, oh, yeah, I'll get $500,000 from a movie and I'm set. But it hasn't happened. I think that small presses, small publishers there's going to be a resurgence of good literary fiction coming out of smaller houses that don't pay very much. But nobody will expect very much because the 80s will be a dim memory by then. So, I don't think it's the death of the small, good novel at all. There's a lot of interesting stuff being written out. There's a lot of younger people in their 20s writing really interesting things right now. So it's not going to die. Okay, thanks a lot for coming.
I'd like to thank you, Dee, very, very much for coming.
Oh,
This
you're
was
welcome,
just
Suzette.
A thrill. Just a thrill to have you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you for coming tonight. This was great. We'll be back next week, but we'll be at Bojangles, and a different venue for the writer series. And it will be with the Missoula Writing Collaborative, who will provide writers for our reading, as well as some high school writers who will be sharing their work. So I can't thank you enough, Dee, for coming tonight, and thank you, Barb, for introducing Dee. And thank you for coming tonight. So there are refreshments, compliments of Freddy's, and I'm sure Dee will be happy to visit with you. And so thank you again very much for coming.
Try and give you a hint.
Okay. Well, welcome. I'm very happy to welcome you to the fourth in the series of the Young Adult Writer Series from the Missoula Public Library and the Missoula Writing Collaborative. And tonight we have members of the collaborative reading from their works, and they will be accompanied by Dick Ostheimer, percussionist. And so I'm very, very happy to welcome you to Bojangles, and would like to thank Harley for allowing us to be here tonight. Thank you, Harley. And to welcome Cheryl Nothy, Sally Koba, and Karen Schultz, thank you, to our reading tonight. And to all of you who would like to share your reading also, please feel free to come up afterwards, and we'll have a short break, and that'll give us an opportunity to write down names and to be able to introduce you. So thanks a lot, and I'd like to turn it over to Cheryl.
Kundalini, yeah. I will try and speak really loudly, and if you can't hear me, just make a sign or something, okay? The first poem that I'm going to read is called Kundalini, and Kundalini comes from Eastern religion and yoga, in the belief that there is a snake coiled at the bottom of the spine, and at middle age or younger, if you're a practitioner, this snake unwinds and goes up your spine, releasing the life energy into your crown chakra and out to join the universe. So I never thought about it or practiced it until this thing happened, and then I wrote this poem about it, and the poem is called Kundalini. Last night as we lay curled together in that place, reverie, we felt a current of electricity pass between us. Did you feel that? I asked. Yes, he said. I sure did. It came from you, I told him, and moved right up my spine. No, he said. It came from you and went down into my thighs. Kundalini, I wondered? Snake in spine uncurling? I lay awake and imagined the stars through the ceiling. The little dog crept up to sleep beside me. Honey, I whispered, I think this is a good sign. But he was already dreaming, said, oh, oh, oh. He had gone ahead of me into that dark country. This next poem is a poem about Marvin Gaye, whose death was never properly mourned in this country. I was living in D.C. the day he died, and it was this miraculous day of dancing and mourning. A poem I wrote 15 years ago and have since forgotten shows up in a collection of women's humor, for which I am paid $37.50. I wrote that poem in a Roach Motel, across the street from the theater where Lincoln was killed. I wrote that poem in the days when I woke up still drunk to cry about my life. The W fell off the sign outside our window, turning waffle shop into awful shop. Pink neon illuminated the face of a man dead out with red wine. On the day that Marvin died, record stores cranked up their speakers and opened their doors, flooding us with his song. People standing on the street and at the bus stop started dancing, sexy and gentle. Everyone was sad, and it was hot. Big ladies wiped their faces and shook their heads, said, "A man like that." I called my friends in Minneapolis. Well, outside, D.C. swayed. No one there seemed especially hip to the loss we had all suffered. They were not shaking their hips in the street and sweating, and some of us cried. It seemed to me America never fully mourned the loss of Marvin Gaye, beside the city of his birth, which has never recovered. But that day, in the heated core of the city, bus exhaust and carbon monoxide rising, tired legs shifting weight back and forth, Marvin sang, "Let's get it on," and we did. Today, a check comes in the mail for that old poem, while I am lying on the couch looking at nothing, where I used to sit and write. Sometimes now I think about career instead. This is how the mind works, sometimes, or stops working and lets the reptiles loose. In the same way an old man could shoot his son. In the same way a voice is stopped forever, or just long enough to be forgotten. But I no longer live at the offal shop, and I got some money in the mail for a poem that came flashing across my bed in pink neon. When Marvin died, D.C. mourned, I fled. This one is about migraine now. The next poem is called Migraine. It's called Half Head, which means migraine. And it's all true. Cranial vasoconstriction precipitated by irritability and rage. Massive, slow potential deep within the brain radiates to open the gates of pain within the spine. Visual tumult, delirium in which latticed, faceted, and tessellated motifs predominate. I lie on the cool wood floor behind the chair. The little dog comes over to rest his head on mine. Medicine dog. He forces his nose into my neck and breathes and shudders. I count my pulse by the explosions in my temples. Small animals chase back and forth. Insects march the edges. 5 days pass where landmines behind my eyes respond only to light. Scintillating scotoma, light swallowed by dark, launched by expanding phosphenes, geometric spectra, vicious circles, implicit in the cerebral repertoire from spinal horn to brainstem formation, innate resonance mechanism on the borderlands of epilepsy, ascending bombardment of the cortex, which responds with activity all its own. In the emergency room, I hold my head in my hands in dark glasses. The nurse walks in with the secret to my well-being, a needle full of Imitrex, which explodes behind my shoulder to close my throat. My limbs burn. Heat rises into my head. Lie down, she says. Wait for it to work. First, the beating of the heart was felt, which became audible as sound. 2 lights appeared before the eyes. The figure of an old woman in a red cloak offered something with the smell of Tonkin beans. Slowly, my throat opens. The burn ceases and the great gong of my skull is still. I do not have the nightmare that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I do not hear the first birds as the gray lifts. Head sore as a basketball, I walk through the house like I am walking on ice. I do not make any sudden moves. The great bruise of my head is restful. There is no echo. Get a needle of your own, the nurse tells me. She mimes a hand, releasing a plunger into her thigh. When the headache comes, shoot this into your leg. It closed my throat, I tell her. Only for a while, she says. I was afraid, I say, that I would die. Yes, she says, but the question is, isn't it worth it? In the form of hallucinatory display, an entire self-organizing system, a universal behavior at work, holds not only the secrets of the neurons deep within the brain, but the creative heart of nature itself. The outskirts of the visual area boil over with tumultuous light. Particular symptoms to which particular symbolic values are attached. Dynamic patterns illuminate the substrate of the mind. Organize to destroy. Organize to destroy. I run my mind over the roof of my head like a tongue at a tooth, wonderingly. Where did the headache go? And for how long? I am like a man who survives an airplane crash to walk out of a bloody cornfield. This is a love poem about chaos. Slept beneath you on a narrow cot last night, your long hair tumbling down, although I hear when you married you cut it off. Disoriented with love and yours again, I don't think chaos is so mysterious. If there's no overriding force and no reason, if heroic love simply disappears over a few inconsequential events, one silly winter, your silence, my motorcyclist, and the one woman at the bar more desperate than I was, you married her. Temper and all. Low self-regard. After that, I never saw you. She made you get rid of your dog? I went on a wild carnival ride across New York and on into Idaho. Good things happened in spite of myself. However, there are still days I awaken addled with loss over something you said drunk in a pizza parlor in South Dakota. Those miles of icy highway we swerved, drunk on the farm with the northern lights luminous over the junked cars, shooting guns from our bed. I have been chasing you since childhood. Bike, bar, Greyhound bus. I dragged my suitcase over the rutted field toward the single light bulb on your porch, your chicken-killing dog. For years I watched the windows of your house for a sign. If there are no larger patterns here, if it's simply entropy and momentum, a bunch of inescapable laws in a crazy salad, if it's only barometric pressure and ricocheting electrons, if you simply flew into space due to torque and inflection, and I was flipped 8 ways to market in the opposite way, with no underlying intent, then I am broken here, crushed by belief, to summon you in sleep, to wake and live in grief. I'm going to finish with a piece called Hidden in a Better Place. This is a Christmas poem. And the style in which it's written is called the acrostic, where you write the word like Christmas up and down on the page, then your first line has to start with a C, and your next with an H, and your next with an R. So this says Christmas, Christmas, over and over. Those were the difficulties of the structure I had to work within. So Dick, the tone here is hysterical, holiday. Okay. Murderous Norwegian family. Okay. Christmas at our house was live from hell. No one could rise above their problems long enough to invest the season with any hope. Someone missed Christmas dinner. Someone else was very drunk. Someone cried. Tom was having another emotional crisis involving my mother's car, whiskey, pornography, and several prostitutes. Year after year we went on. Horrible dinners. Everyone wept crocodile tears or else ignored each other completely. Hell. Uncle Melvin passed a bottle of red wine, offered some to me with red eyes, and metaphoric cigar. I avoided him. Sometimes Aunt Avis brought a bottle and cried about the daddy. Man so mean, all his kids need medication, and only seem to be listening. Casinos are where Bob and I go Christmas Eve to hear bells ring and see lights wink. I order the fish platter and a diet soda. We toast peace of mind and zero population growth. Maybe later we'll climb Jumbo with the dogs and yell our best regards to the city beneath us, sparkling with all the false hope in the world. Christmas Eve, my brother hauled out the deer rifle and shot right through the walls and ceilings from my parents' bed. I was working in Idaho, didn't hear about it for months. Said to my dad on the phone that I would call the police, that alcoholics who play with guns are not a laughing matter. And of course, my dad went on automatic pilot and said in a toneless voice that this time my brother had scared himself and this just might stop the drinking. And then he told me he'd hidden the rifle in a better place. Of course, the best year was the one my Aunt Beatrice stole the cop car. He was an innocent, one of her newer dates, a man who had never really seen her seriously loaded. So after they argued some in Aunt Donna's living room, Aunt Beatrice stole the keys from his coat and tried to teach herself to drive in his squad car, making great smashing crashes into the cars behind and then in front of her. Christmas Eve, the red lights were swinging across all of our faces, standing in the snow in the front lawn. She was always like that. She only dated cops. Carolers frighten me. Holidays are evil duties. Relish tray. Marshmallow fruit salad. I would not like codfish boiled in lye. Sweets disappear into the mouth of the love-shaped void. Tom is downstairs, and I wonder where that gun is hidden. My mother went all out again this year. All of the sisters chain smoke in the kitchen. Same old shit, men doze before the game. Can we put this thing to rest? Call a halt to the march of the wrapping paper? Rapture to sit in my living room in silence, teetotaling, maybe a few dogs on the couch. All of us simply stunned by the rapacity of appetite. Thank you, Dick. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm next. I'm Sally Koba, and the first poems that I'm going to read are prose poems. That means they look like prose on the page. There's not really line breaks in them, and so Dick is just going to have they're kind of little stories in the beginning. So I guess he's going to have a regular steady beat in the background or something like that. And this first one's called Love, and it's about when I was in the first grade. So, Love. In spring, I spent the night at Tammy's. She had twin sisters and lived in a trailer. One day she brought in the best doll, and then we were friends. This doll was remarkable for pissing in its big head. There was a boy named Lincoln who was born with a short leg. He wore a special elevator shoe and limped after us to the jungle gym. Grabbing my hands on the shiny bars, I twirled with clenched fingers until I blistered. And then the girl fell off the slide, and there were bloodstains on the concrete. There was a kid who wasn't in school yet. He had a crew cut and wore overalls. During recess, we stood on our side of the fence like an army. Red Rover, come over, fatty, we would yell. Hansel boy, close your eyes. Stick your fat finger through the fence. Or, there were twigs, grass, and gravel to gather and throw at him. One Saturday, I went to Tammy's trailer and colored until her sister licked stars on our sheets. I preferred doing women's dresses the best, striping them. We both wanted the mint green crayon. The wind came suddenly, stirring our papers about the room. The mint curtains blew loosely, and then the rain came, a soft wintry rain, sounding like blueberries landing in a tin cup. At night, we watched the building falling down, crashing in fire, and people screaming. The blue sleeping bag was damp from our bath. We had drawn letters on each other's backs through soap bubbles. The next day, her mother fixed us eggs, which I hate because they run. I cried because I couldn't stand it, the white part of the egg. Then Tammy led me to the piano, where she hurt my fingers teaching me a song. Her father had a beard and a gun. It said, "Don't go over 10 miles per hour." Then I stole my mother's ring and gave it to Tammy on the bus. Her face lit up. She bit into the bright apple appliqued on the chest of my shirt. "Yum, yum, yum," she said, but it hurt, so I cried. Her mother called my mother. You know how it is. I'm sure you know how it is. Okay. Now we're on to the second grade, and this is called Dog Pants. And I used to have a pair of pants that I loved that had dogs all over them, so hence the title. Dog Pants. In the second grade, it was about the yellow carpet, sitting with your legs crossed while the girl in back of you put a fake egg down your head, touched your cheeks and shoulders, and the teacher's nails were red. You floated above the clock. You decide to pick violets in the weeds beyond the playground. You have your dog pants on and your tennis shoes. Today you ran under the parachute again. In the weeds, your shoes got muddy. You do some hopscotch, pick up a pebble as if to throw it, your purple and white poncho lifting away from your body. You have your dog pants on. The air is cold, too cold for the dog pants. But the sun is bright, so bright that you squint in the photo outside with the class, hunched over, unhappy with your hair blowing. You wet a paper towel and wrap the wilted flowers gently and place them on your desk. You have your dog pants on. The teacher walks by. You want to give her your flowers, but you don't. You carry them home on the bus, run down the hill, and then you throw them on the ground. And then you get sick with a bad cold. Eric Belford says how pretty your hair looks when it's brushed, and you spend the night in Dayton staring out at buildings, and you dance with the husband in your pajamas. That may be kind of complicated to follow, I don't know. It sounded like it just then when I read it. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Okay, now I'm moving into adulthood. This poem is called Butte, and this is from a series of love poems. And I have them from cities all over Montana, Phillipsburg, Yaak, Butte. And Butte's one of my favorite ones, so I thought I'd do that one. Okay, Butte. It seemed to be our honeymoon. We left on Friday afternoon and knew that our friends would call later and complain. This did not matter. You drove, and I wore your baseball hat backwards because this was my life gone a different route. Not backwards, but I felt heady from my cigarettes, and you called it my wild girl phase. Eddie's room cost us $30, and Eddie had a big scar running down his face. There was a zigzagged red line in neon underneath Eddie outside. Our room smelled of Lysol, and I breathed it in. We ate our dinner at the Red Rooster, and our waitress was a hunchback giant in black who used a cart to wheel our food. That night, we just lay in Eddie's bed, curled around each other. The next morning, I got up first and moved the chair away from the door and walked out into the freshest day ever. I had never felt so good. 2 women were coming to clean our room, and the Indian woman told me that she liked my shoes. I crossed the highway to get us coffee, but there was none. We left Eddie's by noon. We stopped at some places, but we mostly drove. Now it's deep in our minds, the copper mines, the depleted houses sagging, the gray, dull sky. In your mind and mine somehow. We looked in windows of the Copper King's mansion. Then we ate Chinese food downtown. These stranded people, the plump Chinese woman in red with her head bent over a newspaper. Okay, and here's one that's kind of in the same series, and this is called Vacation Spot. And this is about going to some hot springs. So here's Vacation Spot. A little piece of heaven, hot springs that we reached after walking through the snow. Naked on the cold March day beneath the springs, then we found the vacation spot. Rows of empty cabins overlooking a rushing creek, one used for whitewater rafting. We were the only ones there at this time of year, but for some odd reason, the owner kept the hot tub on. We left our little cabin and went to the tub. For the second time that day, took off our clothes. This had to have been better. That's the end of that poem. Okay. Okay. This one is called Flathead Lake 1, and it's also in the series. Okay. What did you look for? Were the questions answered? Over the gray snow we walked. Do you recall the gray snow? What do you call the woman who sings all day? Did she lean out of the balcony? Could you hear the saxophone? What pleasure are you looking for? And then we walked along the lake. The day remained still. Is this written down? Do you remember the whole of it? Did it feel too contained? If this is just a joke, the moon poured light on her slender legs. We had to walk for miles down the lonely beach. What were you looking for? There were several reasons. And then, you see, it started to snow so badly we were forced to stay. Why did you lie like a child? Don't you see she was crying? This is just one place they went to. There was the hotel room by the lake, the view of the still water, the balcony they leaned over smoking cigarettes, the waitress who forgot the pepper, and then he went back to bed, or smoked a cigarette in the chair naked, and then she went back to bed, and the snow continued to fall in the lake. Yes, the snow continued to fall. Okay. This is a poem that I just wrote, and it's about when I went up into the rattlesnake at night one time, and I was just sitting there with a friend of mine, and someone came by, and it was kind of, we had a moment of fear, like, is this person going to do anything to us? So, and nothing happened, but this poem came out of that. So it's just called Rattlesnake Night in August. Okay. And this first line kind of mimics a Wallace Stevens poem. If you know that, I'll tell you.